consultant to the World Bank on indicators of development, among many other roles, and I think he'll be touching on some of those and some of his kind of current and future projects as well throughout the talk. So as I mentioned, today Arthur will be talking to us about climate change, global pollution, biodiversity, can we turn a corner, exploring what steps we need to take to overcome our current environmental crisis. Just to give you a bit of housekeeping before we get started, the talk will be about 30 or 35 minutes, and we will have a Q&A afterwards. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Arthur, you should have a button at the bottom of the page saying Q&A, so you can post your questions there, and then we'll try and kind of discuss as many of these questions as possible throughout the Q&A section, so I'll bring up those questions. And yeah, the whole event should last about an hour, so we'll be finishing around 9 o'clock. But without further ado, welcome Arthur, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us this evening. So I hope this will be an interesting talk. I should perhaps warn you that the first part is a little bit depressing, because when we look at the problems we're facing in the world, it's not very encouraging, but I'll try to be more hopeful as we go through the presentation this evening. And let me start sharing my screen to share some of the text with you. So you can now all see it. If we start with what's the most pressing of the environmental crises, climate change, and we've just had the third part of the IPCC report on climate change. But the second part was really dealing with impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. It came out a couple of months ago. And it showed that human-induced climate change is already widespread. And we're seeing the adverse impacts, which are proportionally affecting the most vulnerable, the poor, the developing countries, and so on. Some of the impacts are already irreversible. And they point out that over 3.3 billion people are in highly vulnerable situations to climate change, along with a high proportion of species on this planet. So this is not something little concern of a little marginal group. This is half the world population. And they say even with 1.5 degrees of temperature rise, we're seeing multiple risks to our environment, to our survival impact. And of course, there'll be complex, compounded, and cascading risks. It's not just one here and there. Each one interacts with the others. And it's hard to predict in these complex systems where they will all go. They may run away, cases, tipping points that we run into. They pointed out that if we exceed 1.5 degrees, we'll release further greenhouse gases irreversibly. So it'll be much harder to come back again if we go over that limit. Already, that's a dangerous point, and we really can't afford going any further, and yet we're well on the way to doing so at the moment. Already, ecosystem adaptation has reached hard limits. Things like coral reefs are under extreme pressure and may disappear within a few decades if we continue to allow runaway warming. At the moment, there's massive bleaching again on the Great Barrier Reef. In Australia, it's happening more and more frequently. All over the world, corals have been dying from exposure to excessive heat. So, this is not something in the future, it's happening right now. So we need climate resilient development for humans and for nature. And for that, we need to conserve 30 to 50% of natural areas, far beyond what we're doing at the moment. And they said the next decade or less is decisive to stay below 1.5 degrees. We've got to make rapid and extreme changes now if we want to avoid the catastrophes that are on the horizon. One example, one thing that climate change is doing is causing the sea level to rise. Hot water expands, melting ice flows into the sea, and the sea level is going up. The worst case scenario pointed out by IPCC is a rise of 2.5 meters in this century. Now, over 250 million people live less than 2 meters above sea level. So they would be displaced by that kind of sea level rise. This includes cities like Jakarta, Rio de Janeiro, Miami. There were 150 coastal cities of over 1 million people that would be flooded out and totally displaced by such a sea level rise. With 1 meter rise by 2100, that would expose an additional 2 million people in the 2-meter exposed zone. So this is not something that would stop with that number of people. It would get much worse. Looking back in the past, over the last 3,000 years, sea level varied by less than 8 centimeters. Between 1900 and 2016, it rose 14 centimeters. Since 2016, it's gone up another 8 centimeters, so it's accelerating. The rise will certainly continue. There are lots of things we can't do to stop it now. A lot is sort of built into the warming already taking place. The best we can hope for is to keep the rate of rise constant. But imagine what that will still mean in terms of displacing major parts of the population in the world. We thought we had a problem with migrants and refugees now. Imagine if it becomes hundreds of millions of people. And this is the kind of thing that's, almost nearly locked in at the moment if we don't make very rapid action. The IPCC scenarios say, well, if we can cut carbon emissions to zero by 2050, sea level might only rise by 50 centimeters by 2100. That's a bit more manageable. If we take little action, we get to 2.5 meters, that will continue by 2150, 5 meters of sea level rise. And for instance, the Thwaite Glacier in the Antarctic is showing increased instability. There's been massive recent heating in the Antarctic as well. If it collapses, which you could do very easily, that's another 65 centimeters of sea level rise. So you can see we're really teetering on the edge of a major transformation in the whole geography of the planet if we lose so much of the inhabited land area just from sea level rise. The other crisis, of course, biodiversity, is also in crisis. We've already lost 60% of the global animal biomass and 80% of insect biomass in Europe. 1 million species out of 8 million are threatened with extinction. We'll see a collapse of essential ecosystem services like pollination and so on if we allow this to continue. So it's the whole foundation of the natural systems that are at risk from the changes that are coming rapidly. Another crisis is pollution. We use 100 billion tons of matter annually in our manufacturing processes, in our various human activities, including tens of thousands of chemicals. These include poisons, pesticides, agricultural chemicals, antibiotics, endocrine disruptors, carcinogenic substances, long-lived radioactive isotopes. They're the greenhouse gases, ozone-depleting substances, ionizing particles. Many of these are newly invented and manufactured on a large scale beyond natural processes. And of course, what happens to them after we use them? They become wastes, they become pollutants, greenhouse gases, even space junk. At the moment, we have some entrepreneurs planning to launch thousands of satellites into space in a competition to control the internet. And that's going to fill the space with so much junk, we won't be able to launch other satellites and create dangers for all the uses of space. But there's no control, there's no governance of that. People can still do what they want. We'll see complex mixtures of interactions between all these different pollutants. We don't know how they interact and what effects they can have on our health or on the environment. They will certainly have impacts on nature of the air, the land, and the oceans. And of course, for these pollutants, boundaries have no relevance. And we have a number of international conventions for various pollutants, but they're a very slow mechanism. They cannot cope. We just decided we need another convention in OceanGate in the next 2 or 3 years on plastic pollution, one pollutant at a time when there are tens of thousands. There's no way that this present mechanism can keep up with the challenges that are coming just from pollution. So we have multiple interconnected crises, not only the environment, but economy, society, health, governance, and even war. Among the economic crises, we see now the poor are hit by rising prices. We need to transform all the energy systems underlying our economy. We see growing unemployment in many places. We see an increase in extreme wealth, but we're failing to address poverty. So the extremes are getting worse. We have the social crises, the failures of trust and trustworthiness in society around the world, the fragmentation and loss of social cohesion. We see, persistent racism, our failure to achieve gender equality, the neglect of marginalized groups, and now more and more manipulation by political extremists and populists. So the whole sort of thing is becoming harder and harder for society to function. We've got, of course, the health crisis. The pandemic, may be getting slightly better, but still major problems around the world, and who knows what new variant will come next. We saw in this crisis the importance of private gain over public health, as large pharmaceutical companies sold their vaccines to the rich countries at high prices and made enormous profits while depriving the poor countries of the world from necessary protection. What we need is a single global system for such challenges where national borders have lost their meaning. But only global solidarity can save the world from such drawn-out suffering. And we don't have that at the moment. It actually broke down a lot during this health crisis. This, of course, shows ultimately we have a crisis in governance. We see failures at governance at all levels. Governments sign up to beautiful promises at the United Nations to deal with environmental issues, sustainable development goals, and so on, but they fail to deliver. We've got widespread corruption, the loss of trust, and a retreat from peace and security around the world. So even this crisis in multilateralism, as long as we maintain the paradigm of absolute national sovereignty, which this means that free riders will always undercut even the most enlightened multilateral action. Many governments are trying to do the right thing, but there are always others who have other priorities at the moment, whether it be having war or corruption or whatever, and couldn't care less about something, and they destroy the common action that is needed.
Yeah, you're quite spoiled for eating out in Cambridge.
What's used today to fan hatred.
Because a lot of places come to Cambridge for a night out, so there's like always room for another restaurant kind of thing.
Failures in ethics, values, morality, and spirituality. That's the root of our problem. These are the rules by which we're functioning in our society.
I live just off Bell Road. It's like
my first part was rather dangerous for your mental health.
Curry and
this is an ethical challenge.
Food from everywhere, man.
And we can look at the various dimensions of it and say, where can we find that most people fault lies? Often people say, this is a population problem. There are too many people on the planet. But we've been warned about this for a long time. Over 100 years ago, the founder of the Baha'i faith said, civilization so often vaunted for the learned exponents of arts and sciences will, if allowed to overreach the bounds of moderation, bring great evil upon men.
Apparently there's a couple of good
the day is approaching when its flame will devour the cities.
But we just figured we'd just going to go in August because, he goes on holiday to Bradford.
So is it a population problem? Well, the population has tripled in my own lifetime.
Living the high life.
But despite the great increase in wealth, half the people on this planet struggle to make ends meet. It's poverty that drives rapid population growth. People have more children because they need to try to survive. If we reduce inequality and educate women, the population will stabilize. So this is the symptom of other problems, it's not the root of the problem itself. So what's wrong? We've overshot the planet's carrying capacity, and we're rapidly degrading the natural environment and resources upon which our future and that of future generations depend. This is nothing new. Already in 1972, the young group of modelers of MIT did a report for the Club of Rome called The Limits to Growth. And in their computer models, they modeled life expectancy and population, resources and pollution and so on. And these graphs show from 1900 to 2000, 2100, 2 centuries. And the models showed business as usual on the left. If we continued to develop as we were, we'd do quite well until about 2020, 2030, when civilization would collapse. Because nobody liked that message. Nobody wants to think that they're heading for collapse. So this was derided at the time. They redid the study for the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and the model showed that if we made a transition to sustainability at that time, by 1995, we could stabilize things and have a reasonable standard of living and a more sustainable society. But they warned even then, if we waited until 2015 to make the transition, we couldn't avoid a major crisis in mid-century, and the quality of life and the standard of living possible afterwards would be much lower because it would have destroyed more of the planet's resources and capacity. So these were computer models, and you can say, well, what does a model say? So scientists went back to say, how well did those models predict what actually happened since 1972? We're right on track to collapse. The various curves follow precisely what we predicted, only we did slightly better on birth rates and death rates. The only thing that had changed was that any kind of a stabilized scenario where we might achieve sustainability no longer seemed to be a realistic possibility. today. So this is really what we're looking at. And of course, where does this come from? There was a scientist warning on affluence a couple of years ago, in which the scientist said the most significant impact on the environment and sustainability comes from the wealthy and our society of abundance. Our materialistic consumption is not compensated by advances in technology. The only way we can avoid the climate and biodiversity catastrophes is through a significant reduction in our lifestyle and GDP in Western economies, with all the losses of employment and changes in our economic model that this implies. We must rethink our communities from the bottom up and simplify our ways of living. This is what the scientists are telling us. This is what the science is saying. But nobody wants to hear reducing our GDP in Western economies and so on. This would be political anathema in our present way of thinking. And of course, the Bahá community as well has said very much the same thing. Our international governing body wrote some years ago, having penetrated and captured all significant centers of power, information at the global
just
level,
said penetrated.
dogmatic materialism ensured that no competing voices would retain the ability to challenge projects of
5 years
worldwide
old.
economic exploitation. And that's what's been happening for decades now. They continue, materialism's gospel of human betterment produced today's consumer culture, pursuing ephemeral goals. For the small minority of people who can afford them, the benefits it offers are immediate and the rationale unapologetic. The breakdown of traditional morality has led to the triumph of animal impulse, as instinctive and blind as appetite. Selfishness becomes a prized commercial resource. Falsehood reinvents itself as public information. Greed, lust, indolence, pride, even violence acquire not merely broad acceptance, but social and economic value. And unfortunately, we can see that in many countries today, in many economic systems. They continue, today, the world is assailed by an array of destructive forces. Materialism rooted in the West has now spread to every corner of the planet. Breeding, in the name of a strong global economy and human welfare, a culture of consumerism. It skillfully and ingeniously promotes a habit of consumption that seeks to satisfy the basest and most selfish desires, while encouraging the expenditure of wealth so as to prolong and exacerbate social conflict. One result is a deepening confusion on the part of young people everywhere, a sense of hopelessness in the ranks of those who would drive progress, and the emergence of a myriad social maladies. So this is really where many of you probably find yourself today. So if we look at, well, can market economics solve this problem? Our neoclassical economic paradigm of the market, which cultivates this consumer society, sees environmental and social issues as externalities. In the market, everything is property to generate a profit, whether it be intellectual property or whatever. And this, of course, favors those with the ability to pay, and therefore the rich over the poor, because the rich can always afford to pay for it. It consumes natural resources by the rate of return on investment, not regeneration of the resource, as a result, raping the planet in the process. Our economic accounting ignores human well-being, what people really care for. The result is this extreme concentration of wealth, while half the world population struggles and persistent poverty around much of the world. In fact, we've institutionalized greed. The principal measure of success is wealth, personal wealth or national wealth measured as GDP. For corporations, success is profit, return on capital, stock market valuation that generate the wealth. And while we condemn individual behavior that is so greedy, selfish, and aggressive that it injures others, we do not see easily how these values are incorporated in our institutions, particularly traditional corporations and major businesses. On the corporate level, corporate greed is institutionalized to maximize profits. We see the behavior of many corporations today. The ends justify any means. Such institutions have no conscience or moral framework of humanity to restrain them. They're just impersonal institutions, people are sort of drowned in them, and there's no larger control. They drive climate change, biodiversity destruction, massive pollution, human exploitation, extremes of poverty and wealth, the arms race as we see today, the privatization of knowledge and science, and most of the other ills that have escaped from any control. And of course, governments should be ensuring our common good in the face of such pressures. But corporate lobbies and corruption
it's
now
like
control
the same
most
for every
governments.
level. It's just like
And
one
there's
thing.
no global governance for
Doesn't make
non-state
any difference
entities
which
or
level you buy it
corporations.
at.
And of course, multilateral cooperation
Doesn't
among
make them
states for
happy.
human rights, remember, fails in implementation
Oh yeah, you need
because
you need
that has no
arsenic
influence over
and
those
liquid
with the real power
exceptions.
today in the economic
Need to
system.
make them happy.
So we've
do.
got serious structural
Oh
problems
yeah.
within which our whole
If you sell
system,
your
which is
data to
working
us, I
today
think that
at the
makes her
planetary
happy.
level.
Sold it.
Again, we see in the Baha'i guidance certain approaches
What you might have to
obtaining
do
wealth,
then is just do
so many
pointless
of which
upgrades
involve the
on
exploitation of others, the
on stuff.
monopolization and manipulation of markets, and the production of goods that promote violence and immorality
she also
are
does your
unworthy
engines
and
as well,
unacceptable.
I think.
But so there's no going back. In this
Those
past
shield
no guide to the future,
boosters.
Or your shield
that
boosters.
future has yet to be invented.
Thing is, you won't get very much for
We
like
already
level
have some
1, but if you
guidance
keep
as where we
going,
need to go.
you'll eventually...
There was a world scientist warning quite recently, calling for immediate action to change course in 6 areas.
Oh, she only does
They
level
said
1.
for
so-
energy, we must
What does
eliminate
she do for
fossil
engines?
fuels and shift immediately to renewables.
Yeah.
For short-lived air pollutants that kill millions
So
every year,
basically, your dirty
we should be
drive makes
slashing
them
black carbon and
faster,
soot
better.
and methane emissions and hydrofluorocarbons.
Clean makes them
With respect to nature,
like
we need to
more
restore
efficient, but
and
you
permanently
basically you
protect
want dirty
Earth's
drive.
ecosystems to store and accumulate carbon and
Okay.
restore biodiversity.
Well, won't
For
generate
food,
anyway.
we need to switch to mostly plant-based
Well, you might as well
diets,
because you know
reducing
it will
food
make your
waste,
I
foster
can't
parents
make
shit.
shopping
anything.
practices to make them
Oh,
more
sorry.
sustainable. For the economy,
So
we
I'm
have to
refusing
move
to
from
do
rapid
it.
GDP growth and overconsumption by the wealthy to ecological economics
Armoured
and a circular economy in which prices reflect
overcharged.
the full environmental costs of goods and services.
Oh, right, I can do
human
armoured or
population,
low emissions.
Stabilizing and gradually reducing the population by providing
I'd
voluntary
probably go
family
armoured.
planning and supporting education and rights for all girls and young women.
Although you've got
So when
shitloads
we
of
look at
iron,
things like
so you
climate
might want to go
action,
with that.
we should focus
Low
on social
emissions.
justice for all, by providing basic human needs.
So it
reducing
gives me
inequality.
heat
This is
efficiency.
again what the scientists are telling us we must
Don't
be
know what
doing
that does
today.
though.
So
What does
I
heat
let's try to
mean,
imagine the future
Well,
we want.
it
then.
means
Let's go from the
you know, the
negative
heat
side
when
of
you,
things to a more positive view of where we can be going.
basically
This
when
one
you-
gives me more power.
First, people to
Yeah,
question
the
our
overcharge one
assumptions.
does.
No, the
Are we really
armoured.
inherently
Oh yeah, it
aggressive
gives you a little bit
and
more power
competitive
as well.
in the struggle to win out over
But it
others?
makes it heavier, which will
Or
reduce your
perhaps
jump
we're
range.
more a social species?
I mean, it's not much
Is
of it.
life a zero-sum game
Yeah, you know,
where winning
it's all a
means that
trade-off.
someone
Yeah.
else must be the loser?
Yeah, so I can
What
build
about
this
our
one, you see.
gendered stereotypes? Our identities, based on racism, on nationalism, and religious bigotry, have deep roots in our subconscious. We inherit so much without questioning that it requires a real effort on our part to bring ourselves to account each day for what we're trying to do with our lives. Some of the things we have to consider in looking at this future. What should be the physical characteristics of the world we want to build and live in? How should our human systems relate to and integrate with the natural systems of the biosphere? What about the qualities
Wide
of our
angle,
communities?
long range,
What about the systems of organization and governance required from the local to the
lightweight.
global levels? How would the
you go
economy
lightweight.
function?
If I go
What would be
lightweight,
everybody's
then
rights and
it gets
responsibilities?
back.
And most fundamentally, what would be the underlying principles and values to guide this ever-evolving system? I'd like to share with you some of the proposals that we have to respond to some of these questions. Also, what wisdom from older generations might be useful? What new wisdom of a different world can they bring to our discussions? Is there a role for religion? And what future do we want to invent? It's clear we face real difficulties today. We're in a world of disintegration and integration. The immediate future looks pretty grim.
You can drop the
There's no
weight of
immediate
your
end
scanners
to
by
crises
less,
and
like
catastrophes. The negative side of human
75%
nature
total.
clearly dominates our economic political, and social frameworks today. And we can see that all around us.
But it just means that if you did it to your,
clearly continuing.
If you got high range sensors, you could drop the weight down from 110 easily down to
we could already start building. And that would
sort
speed
of
up
20 or 30, which is what I was flying with just then anyway.
So my recommendation is focus on hope.
So frustrating.
Hope is a very rare commodity today. But we can be positive, full of creative imagination, drawing on the fantastic potential hiding within each of us. And your youth are the hope of the future.
Dry strengthening it is.
Start. But tomorrow is already the future. The more we build forward, the more that future will open up. If you're interested in more about issues of hope, I've written a whole book on the subject a few years ago, which you might be interested in, but I won't dwell on that now. We clearly need a shift in perspective, focusing more on values. And again, from the Bahá community of Universal House of Justice, they said to alleviate a variety of problems born of the economic inequalities so prevalent in the world today, social and economic development will require, especially among the younger generations, a fundamental shift in perspective, one that changes the way in which certain essential concepts are viewed: the true purpose of life, the nature of progress, the meaning of true happiness and well-being, and the place that material pursuits should assume in one's individual and family life. Social justice will be attained only when every member of society enjoys a relative degree of material prosperity and gives due regard to the acquisition of spiritual qualities. The solution then to prevailing economic difficulties is to be sought as much in the application of spiritual principles as in the implementation of scientific methods and approaches. So, what is the Baha'i perspective of rethinking economics? What might be that better direction for the future? Again, in the International Baha'i Consultative Body, there is an inherent moral dimension to generation, distribution, and utilization of wealth and resources. The stresses emerging out of the long-term process of transition from a divided world to a united one are being felt within international relations as much as in the deepening fractures that affect societies large and small. With prevailing modes of thought found to be badly wanting, the world is in desperate need of a shared ethic, a sure framework for addressing the crises that gather like storm clouds. I think some of those clouds are breaking at the moment in the world. The vision of Baha'u'llah challenges many of the assumptions that are allowed to shape contemporary discourse. For instance, that self-interest, far from needing to be restrained, drives prosperity, and that progress depends upon its expression through relentless competition. To view the worth of an individual chiefly in terms of how much one can accumulate and how many goods one can consume relative to others is wholly alien to Baha'i thought. Wealth must serve humanity.
Yay!
Its use must accord with spiritual principles. Systems must be created in their light. And in Baha'u'llah's memorable words, no light can compare with the light of justice. The establishment of order in the world and tranquility
data mined wake exceptions.
Don't know where to go over them. So, society must develop new economic models. Resources must be directed to furthering a dynamic, just, and thriving social order.
You should be able, because you've got like 300 iron, so you should be able to trade iron for arsenic. That should be quite straightforward.
To provide meaningful employment
the
to help eradicate poverty in the world. So that we might have the design principles for a new economic system to replace the deficient one.
Basically, you only get those scanning big ships.
The economic life of humanity has recently
and even then,
like the so many people.
Like 1 in 100 or something.
Injustice is tolerated with indifference. Disproportionate gain is regarded as the emblem of success. Nevertheless, there are certain practices anyone could eschew, such as dishonesty in one's transactions, or the economic exploitation of others. There should be no
saved the recipe, though, so you don't have to come back
economic
here, right?
conduct and one's beliefs.
Yeah.
By applying in one's life principles of fairness and equity, Each person can uphold
when
a
you
standard
go to
far
engineers
above
workshop
the low
and you
threshold by which the world measures itself.
In Blueprint.
Humanity is weary
in
for want of a
Blueprint, that's what I
pattern of
mean.
life
Yeah,
to which to aspire.
that's
We should
exactly
aim
what I
for
mean.
actions in our communities which will give hope
Oh, no,
to the
you
world.
had it pinned. Sorry, I'm just confusing you. I'm sorry.
The members of the younger generation would do well to ponder the difference between gaining wealth
That's what I
through earnest
do.
effort
I
in
obfuscate,
fields such as agriculture,
create,
commerce, the arts, and
division.
industry,
So division.
and on the other, obtaining it without exertion or through dishonorable means. Let them consider the consequences of each for the spiritual development of the individual, as well as the progress of society, and ask themselves what possibilities exist for generating income and acquiring wealth that will ensure true happiness through the development of spiritual qualities such as honesty, trustworthiness, generosity, justice, and consideration for others, and the recognition that material means are to be expended for the betterment of the world. So we can start in our local communities. It may be hard to change things first at the global level, but the community is a building block of the global arena. It can provide a space where alternative, inclusive, and cooperative ways of life can find expression, where men wholeheartedly come to see women as equal partners, and all are empowered to develop leadership abilities. Through moral education programs, attitudes of unity and fellowship are instilled from a young age. The participants come to view each other as valued allies, working for the well-being of their communities.
Oh, that reminds me, I need to take the bin out.
Central to this process is the concept of capacity building, of enhancing the ability of participants to better understand the material, social, and spiritual realities of their societies, and to devise next steps as they collectively chart their own path of progress, deriving fulfillment through service. Toward this end, spaces have organically emerged for individuals to reflect together on their challenges, to identify constructive responses, and explore deeper questions related to the meaning of life. These spaces can serve as arenas where hope in times of difficulty finds expression, and bonds of solidarity can strengthen. The capacities, attitudes, and qualities characterizing a community can reinforce its resilience in the face of extreme events or ongoing environmental burdens, such as those that I described to you beginning my presentation. So we can always start at a local level in our own communities and build from there. This is within everybody's reach everywhere in the world today. So the other dimension, of course, going from the local, might say, to the global level, how do we deal with these challenges of governance, these failures of governance at the local level? We already have a guide in Secretary General's Our Common Agenda, adopted by the United Nations this last year. But first, what is the governance problem? I've already described parts of it. National sovereignty, where war is the final recourse to impose one state's will on others. And I wrote this before a recent example of how that's exactly happening. We have international anarchy. There's no real rule of law at the global level. It's all voluntary. We see the struggle for power and world domination, and a pushback against multilateralism. Warfare is increasingly dangerous to the survival of the human race. We have multinational corporations out of control, and a world filled with ego, corruption, and aggression, with the rise of reckless political leaders and autocrats. So what can we do with such a problem? Where do we go? We know the society needs good governance for justice and the common good. We want to build unity and concord at the local, national, and global levels. But too much politics today is based on self-interest, fragmentation, and conflict. The failures of governance are causing many of today's problems.
Hooray.
In fact, national sovereignty becomes a shield
work in your place. You have some massive communal
leaders' misdoings and corruption.
No?
And we see politics dominated by established elites, the rich and powerful,
although, like,
corrupt
because ours is 10 now,
and especially
got, like, a ridiculous array of bins.
And of course, with governments and corporations, as I mentioned, they escape from control.
Like, we've tricked them into letting us have one more than we're meant to.
Sector,
according to their official rules. Well, they don't
always
know
put their
it. We
profit in
just
tax-free
havens
havens
said it was
look at
stolen.
themselves where they want around the world.
Yeah,
they govern against each other. So we need a global.
But because there's so many, they don't even fucking realise. Because it's like hard to figure out.
We should require non-state economic actors, corporations, to include in their legal charters an obligation for social and environmental responsibility, to perform some useful service for society, in addition to profit as a measure of economic efficiency.
We could do
if
loads
we were
more
able to
than
do
we
this
do.
directly in their legal charters, this would empower them to be more effective partners in the system-wide challenges facing the world today. So there are opportunities there, even without changing the whole global system. If we can start building that in to the very foundation of corporations, that will also help us to move in a new and better direction. So how do we encourage the forces?
Mine's a bit weird because I've got a really small blue bin, which
ethics, values, goals, and perspectives,
and then a really massive black bin, which is a bit weird.
We need a vision for a more just and equitable world, able to motivate our positive actions.
Yeah, we've got two big ones.
So can an ethical, even spiritual perspective help us to change our lifestyle and consumption patterns? We already have the UN 2030 Agenda, Sustainable Development Goals that give us a framework for action. But we still need institutional global governance for the global scale of our problems. You all know the Sustainable Goals. I won't go into detail about how well they've been negotiated and what they set out to do, and it's a very clear pattern of where we need to go in the years ahead. Then, as I mentioned, we have our common agenda, the Secretary General last September, looking at the future of the United Nations itself. First, he said, now is the time to re-embrace global solidarity and find new ways to work together for the common good. It must include urgent and bold steps to address the triple crisis of climate disruption, biodiversity loss, and pollution destroying our planet. Second, now is the time to renew the social contract between governments and their people and within societies, so as to rebuild trust and embrace a comprehensive vision of human rights. People need to see results reflected in their daily lives. This must include the active and equal participation of women and girls, without whom no meaningful social contract is possible. It should also include updated governance arrangements to deliver better public goods. Third, now is the time to end the infodemic, plaguing our world by defending a common, empirically backed consensus around facts, science, and knowledge. The war on science must end. All policy and budget decisions should be backed by science and expertise. And of course, speaking to you at a university, this would seem to be self-evident. Much of my work at the United Nations has been on building scientific advisory processes to make certain that decisions are backed on the best understanding we have of the world and where we need to go. Fourth, now is the time to correct a glaring blind spot in how we measure economic prosperity and progress. When profits come at the expense of people and our planet, we are left with an incomplete picture of the true cost of economic growth. As currently measured, gross domestic product fails to capture the human and environmental destruction of some business activities. The Secretary General calls for new measures to complement GDP so that people can gain a full understanding of the impacts of business activities and how we can and must do better to support people and our planet. And fifth, now is the time to think for the long term, to deliver more for young people and succeeding generations, and be better prepared for the challenges ahead. We also need to be better prepared to prevent and respond to major global risks. So here the Secretary General has really mapped out a whole set of challenges in terms of the global level of how to move forward, which I will address in the rest of my presentation. So looking at global governance, the world is increasingly globalized and interconnected, but there's no effective mechanism for governance, law, and collaboration at the scale of global challenges and catastrophic risks, whether economic, social, or environmental. So how can we address the vacuum in global governance? I can't answer all of that immediately. With two Bahá colleagues, we published a book a couple of years ago with Cambridge University Press on global governance and the emergence of global institutions for the 21st century. It's available in open access, from Cambridge University Press. We created a whole global governance forum to follow up on this and to carry the ideas forward and to implement many of the proposals we've made in this volume. Very briefly, the approach to say that effective governance at the global level requires the same legislative, executive, judicial functions that we accept as normal at the national level. But nations will only give up the right to make war in exchange for effective mechanisms of collective security and peaceful settlement of disputes. We need a gradual development of relevant international institutions and processes to build confidence in their effectiveness in reducing national insecurity. Of course, we also need carefully coordinated disarmament. We need trust that justice will be done. So states also have to become trustworthy. And we need a collective sense of moral responsibility. If you want to know more, there are 500 pages available in that book. What about environmental governance? So we're looking this evening at climate change, biodiversity, pollution. We started environmental governance 50 years ago, 1972. We've done a lot of good things in the last 50 years, but we still haven't turned the corner. The environment is still getting worse, in spite of all of our efforts. This started back at the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm in 1972. That is a picture I took there. I represented the Bahá international community at that conference and argued in one of the sessions to include collaboration with non-governmental organizations and faith-based organizations in order to do the things that governments themselves aren't able to do. We're making progress in many ways. I've worked on that, as I mentioned, in the United Nations and in other organizations for the last 50 years. Just this last October, UN Human Rights Council approved for the first time the human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So this is finally being enshrined in international human rights law. We've had recent reports like the United Nations Environment Program on making peace with nature as a blueprint for how climate change, biodiversity loss can be tackled jointly in the framework Sustainable Development Goals. So a lot of detail has come out.
I'm really close to ordering a burger. Give me reasons not to.
We have Stockholm Plus 50 coming up in the 2nd and 3rd of June.
Time.
And I'm planning a whole series of activities around that as well. As mentioned, Secretary Agenda, we need to rethink global systems accounting to replace GDP.
Wait, which burger do you think you'll go for?
I'm going for the smoking meat.
Oh yeah, you're a fan of that one, aren't you?
Climate governance.
It's a nice burger.
Climate Governance Commission.
I still haven't tried it, by the way. I keep meaning to.
Forward.
There you go.
In fact, with another...
I know, I keep meaning to.
Copy me.
We published a report.
Well, it's on your recommendation.
A few months ago,
I don't ignore you.
On how we can go.
You do all the time. You want the big cheeseburger meal deal with extra dill pickles.
Biodiversity and pollution
well, I mean, my favourite burger at the moment is Byron's Burgers cheesy halloumi burger.
What governance do we need for our survival?
It's like a deep-fried chunk of halloumi. It's just extraordinary.
The crises are interconnected.
I mean, you can upgrade the burger more than just extra dill pickles, but it doesn't have dill pickles, so it needs them.
To address these interconnected global environmental challenges, protect the global common good.
Crispy fries, mate.
A series of separate conventions and other elements. It's very difficult to get them to work together.
Yeah, although I'm restarting my diet on Sunday, so I won't be having any burgers for a while.
Subsidiarity. With the Global Environment Agency, it's kind of a global level institution.
Well, you know, short-term suffer for long-term gain.
The planetary commons and not anything else.
You know,
the 5 governance functions that such a body would need to have include knowledge provision, so adequate scientific advice, deliberative legislative function, being able to adopt binding legislation for the common good, with equitable sharing responsibilities, leaving no one behind. These have an enabling and implementing function to be able to orchestrate a global system for environmental management in a coherent global strategy while allowing diversity in regional, national, and local approaches. We need a trust and justice building function for accountability, mediation, and dispute settlement. And finally, in a world that's changing rapidly,
instead of a burger,
learning reflexivity function to learn from experience and to adapt to complexity and uncertainty of the world.
If you weren't having a burger, like, what would you be
having? The next step
for
forward
dinner?
in achieving such environmental governance.
I mean, I'm kind of
evolution of UNEP into such a global.
You've had your dinner and you're having another burger.
Polycentric system.
Well, I had a bowl of cereal.
Global rules, norms, and values.
Well, that's not
for
dinner, is it?
Security.
Yeah, but I had 2 pies for
lunch. Its legislative function to be able to adopt binding legislation. Legislation would apply not just to governments, but also to non-state actors like multinational corporations and even individuals, because some are so powerful today they can do whatever they want in the world.
Just sitting there being really hungry.
Advisory council with scientists from all relevant disciplines, the natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, provide an objective basis for action. We also, as I mentioned, need to rethink global accounting. We've got to stop measuring progress and development only in financial terms. So we need alternative global systems of accounting with science-based measures in other than money, reflecting true human and environmental well-being. What's missing in GDP?
They do a store burger, but that doesn't
financial indicators.
fit the deal. So.
They ignore ethics, values, morality, and spirituality. The Secretary General has called for new measures.
So well, it's just like I like the fact that it comes with cookie, drink, and fries.
Potential for selfishness.
12 quid.
So we're working now with the whole system
it's 15
trying to define what might be in such a system, relative to human natural well-being, using relevant science-based non-financial units.
Yeah,
and this will provide a basis for the replacement of the present economic paradigm financial system, which values only monetary wealth with GDP. We were starting with 9 initial indicator forms of capital to respect both the planetary environmental boundaries of the global commons and the minimum social and economic standards for the common well-being of humanity. The environmental accounts include carbon accounts, not only the release of carbon from fossil fuels into the atmosphere, where it becomes carbon debt, but also the role of, say, biodiversity in bringing carbon back out of the atmosphere and sequestering it back where it belongs, in the capital and the soil. We have biodiversity accounts measured directly in biodiversity units of ecosystem services. We're looking at pollution accounts, where the clean environment is the ideal capital, and various kinds of pollution or various kinds of pollution debt that we need to reduce as quickly as possible. For the social economic accounts, we start, of course, minimum basic needs. How do we measure that we're really eliminating poverty, and not simply in terms of whether people are getting some kind of a cash income or minimum income, because there are also citizen societies where none of that is measured. We need to look at food accounts. Is everybody properly fed? Is the planet able to produce enough food for everybody and distribute it to everybody around the world? We need health accounts. Is every human being as healthy as they can be all through their life? Or are there various kinds of health debt we need to address? We need worker employment accounts, saying, can every human being on the planet have some way of contributing usefully to society, whether it be in paid employment or in the many forms of non-paid employment, like homekeeping and raising children or subsistence farming, other things that are not part of the present statistical systems. We need accounts for knowledge and education, because this is maybe intangible, but that's something that has to be passed on from generation to generation. And ultimately, we also need measuring spiritual capital. How well are these higher values being incorporated into the institutions of our society, into our communities, and our own individual lives? These accounts could become the basis to internalize what are now treated as environmental and social externalities, and lead to global taxes or fines on damaging activities, and supporting payments for social contributions and environmental regeneration in the common interest, with the financial system serving primarily to link the capital accounts in an integrated, dynamic global system aiming for human and natural well-being and sustainable development. We mentioned also the problem of global catastrophic risks. So just very briefly, we've also been working on how to identify the risks each country is facing to help them reduce their vulnerability, build on their resilience. For man-made risks, people can make efforts to reduce or eliminate them. We just published the first edition of a Global Catastrophic Risk Index in February, just a month and a half ago. And it's available online for those who want to consult it. Again, with a couple of Bahá colleagues, it's something we've produced together to the Global Governance Forum. I won't go into the details, but it looks at economic stability, the quality of governance, education and skills, gender inequality, business environment resilience, environmental vulnerabilities like we talked about this evening, exogenous vulnerabilities that are all of these things are covered in the measures of this catastrophic risk index. The most at-risk countries, obviously, are places like Sudan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Lebanon, and Mali at the bottom of the list. Least at risk are Denmark, Sweden, Ireland, Finland, and Luxembourg at the top, and you can see all of those in between. This can help countries to see where they have to focus their efforts to become more resilient in the years ahead. And of course, finally, we need to have more trust and trustworthiness in this world. States must trust that decisions are really taken in the common interest. People must trust in their human rights to be respected. Everybody should be able to develop their full potential to contribute to society. Governments must be trustworthy, with everything founded on justice for all. Sacrifices should be shared equitably, and nobody should be left behind. So against this backdrop of climate change, environmental degradation, the crippling extremes of wealth and poverty, the transformation from a culture of unfettered consumerism to a culture of sustainability has gained momentum. It is a transformation that requires an earnest examination of our understanding of human nature and of the cultural frameworks driving institutions of government, business, education, and media around the world. Questions of what is natural and just will need to be critically re-examined. The issue of sustainable consumption and production need to be considered in the broader context of an ailing social order, one characterized by competition, violence, conflict, insecurity, of which it is a part. Progress at the techno and policy levels now needs to be accompanied by public dialogue among rural and urban dwellers, among the materially poor and the affluent, among men, women, and young persons alike, on the ethical foundations, the necessary systemic change. Just the sustainable social order distinguished, among other things, by an ethic of reciprocity and balance at all levels of human organization. And in such an order, the concept of justice is embodied in recognition that the interests of the individual and of the wider community are inextricably linked. The pursuit of justice in the frame of unity and diversity provides a guide for collective deliberation and decision-making that offers a means by which unified thought and action can be achieved. So with that, I'd like to stop my presentation here. If you're interested to know more, the organizations that we were involved in, have a lot more material available on their websites, the National Environment Forum, Public Health Forum, Climate Governance Commission. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope we still have some time for questions. I'm looking forward to the questions you will raise and taking the discussion further. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Arthur, for what is not only a really interesting talk, but quite refreshing to see a talk that very honestly frames the issues, but doesn't just give a general hopeful message at the end, that you've kind of given some really concrete examples and steps of things that we can do. So that's wonderful to see and very refreshing to see. So for the audience now, feel free to put some questions into the Q&A, and I'll get started with the first one. Trip has asked, one side talks about collapse and the other continues to consume. Even if we change our habits immediately, it's too late for those changes to reverse our course in time. What I haven't seen are plans to mitigate the effects of climate change. What are some of the intermediate steps?
That's an excellent question. And it's clear that particularly things like climate change, there's so much inertia in the system that a lot of damage will continue to be done before we can actually turn the corner. And in fact, a lot of the debate recently in the Climate Convention on Climate Change has been about get a better balance between mitigation and adaptation. And while we're trying to pull back on greenhouse gas emissions as rapidly as possible, transforming the whole civilization overnight is not so easy. And therefore, there is a lot of adaptation. I worked for many years in the Pacific Islands. And when you're in a nation like Tuvalu, where the highest point in the country is 4 meters above sea level, and it's a little rubble mound, or in the Marshall Islands, where it's the landfill, where they've dumped all of their garbage, you're very sensitive to the fact that sea level rise is going to wipe out your entire national territory and make everybody climate refugees. So these are things that are already underway, and they're extremely worried. And so all we can say then was, can we at least plan for that? One, can we, if they have to migrate, can we say, we'll take the whole nation as a unit, let them keep their culture, keep their values, even if they have to move somewhere else? And can they also perhaps keep, their marine resources, where normally they would lose them, as a continuing source of income wherever they may have to go? So we clearly have to look at the immediate steps, both with respect to those things that we can't stop, but we also need to acknowledge that many of our problems are due to the extremes of wealth and poverty in the world. And therefore, the more we can do to already start redistributing wealth on this planet, to help those who are the most vulnerable and the least capacity to respond, have the resources to be able to adapt better and to overcome the challenges that are coming, that would be some of the most important immediate interventions. That's why we can't simply say, we'll put climate in one little compartment, biodiversity somewhere else, and so on. It's all part of a package. We need to address these all together, which is why I've treated these all together as an ensemble. I'm a system scientist, basically. And therefore, we have to say, where are the leverage points? And the best leverage points are at the level of our values. That's where we can start changing the way the whole system functions. So the more we can do already to bring in better values, then people will be ready to make the sacrifices in their their wealthy lifestyles because they know that's important for the well-being of the other parts of the world. In the same way that we've seen the response in Europe to the crisis in Ukraine. People are suddenly doing things they wouldn't have done a few weeks ago. We need more of that at a planetary level with respect to all people around the planet.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Arthur. Our next question comes from Christine Mueller, who says that people who are not aware of the planetary environmental crisis have a hard time being open to learn about it. It takes much courage to face humanity's predicament. The fear of increasing economic downturn makes people more narrow-minded, focusing on their self-interest. This manifests itself in, for example, things like nationalism and anti-immigrant attitudes. So how do you think that this fear can be addressed?
Well, I hope that my presentation this evening has been an example of how, because I may have started by looking realistically at all the good things that we have a reason to be afraid about, but then I've tried to show that in fact there are many positive things that we can already start to do to address those. And the first, of course, is can we already set a better example for ourselves and show through our own lives that it is possible, in spite of all of these risks, to say, well, I'm much happier, in fact, living a simpler lifestyle, consuming less, not flying around the world to myself at some tropical beach in some other location just for the pleasure of it, and so on and so forth, and accept those material sacrifices. So it's really at the level of values that people can come and say, well, in fact, those things weren't so important. I think a great part of the challenge is that people are trapped within that consumer lifestyle. But this has been sold to them every day. There are constant messages of advertising and so on that insisting you must buy this happiness means that, dressing like this, and so on and so forth. And so the challenge is really to detach ourselves from that manipulation by the commercial interests around us and to realize we're being manipulated. Then we need to stand back and begin to make those changes. And there are a lot of vested interests that don't want that to happen and spread all sorts of false rumors. That's why I talked about the lack of falsely becoming public information. That's very much the case in much of the world today. So becoming aware of that, admittedly people don't want to because it's challenging to question your basic assumptions. But it has to start with I think with each group we have to say, what are those points where we can find points of agreement? For instance, national sovereignty. People fight for that because it's protecting their national interest. But in fact, we don't have sovereignty in the world, globalized world today. There's little control. What we need is national autonomy, that each nation can find their own path forward. And that's only protected by having a framework of global governance to protect them from the big bullies who want to come in and destroy it for their own special interests. So it's this kind of change in thinking at all levels that will allow us to find positive ways forward and to get people to come and join in that effort to build something better.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I think one of our questions kind of follows on from that. You've mentioned quite a lot of things at different levels, at sort of the local, and you've been focusing now quite a lot on the global, and you've given some very practical solutions for that. But so one of our attendants asks, how can the outline of what you presented here be conveyed to and incorporated by local communities?
Well, that's why, at one point I focused specifically on the fact that local communities have, the capacity to bring many changes over, that we already have various kinds of eco-villages and so on, people trying to alternative attempts to design communities that show different ways of doing things. And I think that for those who are afraid of what's happening, the best security for the future, if there is any kind of larger scale global collapse or increasing problems, be at the community level. That's where you can already, protect yourselves, become more resilient, plan what you would do, if things really get worse and so on and so forth. So you can already say, by starting a community, it's not only developing better ways for the future, it's also building an insurance against the challenges that may be coming from higher levels. And I think that'd be a motivation to say, well, we may be able to control not what's going on at the national level or the global level, but already we can, our local community, build some resilience, make sure that we know that who might suffer the most, how can we help them if they need to be helped, and so on.
I failed
how do we
in
build
my
a better
mission
sense
to
of
stop you
solidarity?
buying food.
Well, you did.
How to
You
do
just like
partnerships we need to
shouted
manage
burgers
through
as soon
the
as I
crisis and
said.
challenge that we're facing. We saw a lot of that in the pandemic.
You were like,
We
stop
saw a
me
lot
ordering
of global
food, and I was like,
solidarity.
oh,
So
aren't
I think there
burgers
we can already
great?
build and take things forward.
Brilliant,
Sorry.
thank you. And another question is kind of rooted to the motivations behind these kind of actions that you're speaking about. So one person is asking, so I'm a little concerned about the idea of expanding global accounting to embrace environmental considerations. Yet we see governments happy to sign up to targets and accounting and then do everything they can to fiddle the figures. So I think a spiritual renewal has to come first. In the current kind of mixture of belief systems that we see in the world, how can this happen?
Well, I think we need to work at all levels. So I think ultimately, yes, the transformation has to come in terms of basic value at a spiritual level. That's where we could really address these challenges of human nature, where the animal side is so dominant today. And until we can bring more spirituality to people's lives and the motivation to willingly make sacrifices because they know that the reward from that in terms of a better character in the future, or if they believe in an afterlife and a better afterlife, that will become the ultimate motivation. So yes, that's the fundamental change that needed. It doesn't mean we can't also start to work at all the other levels. When you're transforming so many parts of a system, and that's where global accounting, particularly, we're trying to design the system not only to be useful to governments at the global level, comparing GDP and things like that. We're trying to design the system so that, in fact, those indicators can be used at the global level, the national, and at the local level. The local community can say, how are we doing on the biodiversity in our own community, in our own environment? How are we doing with, the poor in our community? How are we doing with transmitting our wisdom, our experience from generation to generation? How are we doing in making sure that everybody has adequate health care and so on? Those are things that can be done as much at the local level. So we're trying to come up with a system that's not so complicated that it cannot be applied at each level and motivate change at each of those levels.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And yeah, I guess maybe as a final question, or even just more of a final comment that we've gotten from one of our attendees. They've said that how can we change the notion that we must make sacrifices to change the world to the reality that we are gaining things that benefit us. So kind of switching this idea of sacrifice with one that actually, by making these changes, we're gaining something.
Well, that's because we need to present positive visions of the future. We need to not simply look at the problems, the bad things that are happening, but have a vision of the kind of civilization that can emerge out of the transition we're going through, from a divided vision of nation states, which is 200 years old and particularly dysfunctional, towards a united world community with unity and diversity, with drawing on all the strengths of all the peoples around the planet. So I think by having that positive vision, then it isn't sacrifices anymore. It's really saying, this is how we invest in constructing the better future we would like to have. And we can already see some of the benefits from it, in the rewards that come most immediately. I mean, if we're helping people in our community who are suffering, who need assistance, or young people who are confused about the future, and we can help to guide them, let them see the pleasure of being altruistic and cooperative and so on and so forth. Those are things that are imminently rewarding and feel much better than the kinds of things we've been sold at the past as sacrificing your latest kind of toothpaste or the latest form of tennis shoes or things like that. They're not really sacrificed at all. In fact, those are ways in which you've been trapped into something else. So I think this is why half my message was the positive message of where we can go and how we can build a better. And now is the time to start in doing it, and not pay less attention to those terrible things happening around us. We can't solve all of them immediately, but we can already know that we're investing in the better world that will emerge from this process.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Arthur. And yeah, thank you as well for kind of your whole talk today. It's been really, really interesting, and I think a lot of food for thought for us to go away with. Kind of keeping an eye on the time, I think we might have to close the Q&A session there, but if there are any outstanding questions that people are kind of really keen to get answered, you can send an email to the Cambridge University Bahá Society with your question, and we'll do our best to get those answered.
Food's almost here.
So again, thank you very much to Arthur for the talk today, and to all the lovely behind-the-scenes folks here who have sort of organized this event. Just before we close, there's one quick event that the Bahá Society would like to advertise in case anyone is interested in attending. So we've got a bit of a poster which should be coming up in a moment. An event called Earth Reflections. So Earth Reflections is an event that was created in advance of the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow. And since it has spread throughout the UK and kind of been done many times. So it's kind of a space to maybe have more of these discussions on values. So specifically kind of a space to enjoy kind of poems or reflections or prayers, tributes, music, kind of from all backgrounds. Just to sort of reflect on our connection with the earth, that, you know, quite often we're thinking about really difficult things or thinking about kind of big actions we need to take, and sometimes it's important to have these spaces where we can just kind of appreciate the environment and our connection with it. So if you are interested in attending this event, it will be an online event. You can sign up to the mailing list either with this QR code or then by emailing Bahá at cusu.cam.ac.uk. So yeah, we will send out more information about the exact date and time for that event. But yeah, other than that, thank you very much to everyone for attending, and thanks again to Arthur for your talk.
Thank you for inviting me. I was a member of the equivalent at Stanford when I was an undergraduate, and California when I was a graduate, so I've worked in that. I very appreciate your efforts in your university to get these ideas around and give some hope to the future for everybody, you know, at Cambridge and beyond.
Thank you.